So I have a question for all of you. Are you smarter than a fifth grader? Worse yet, are you smarter than a 15-month-old? Because I would be in obesity clinic trying to take care of the patient, and of course the entire family would be there, and the 15-month-old would be handed the mother's iPhone or iPad and was more adept at utilizing it than I was. So while I am not smarter than a 15-year-old, I think I am a little wiser. Presumably you are too, because you care about the science. Anybody who knows anything about me knows that I'm all about the science. So today we're going to talk about the science of technology. And that science, this talk could just as easily have been called the following. Welcome to the dark side of the Force. Because that's what this is. This is the other side, the Darth Vader of the Force, and we're going to talk about why that is and the science behind why. So I do have a couple of disclosures that I should at least get out of the way. I did write these two books on top. I am the Chief Science Officer of a nonprofit here in the Bay Area called Eat Real. REAL is an acronym, stands for Responsible Epicurean and Agricultural Leadership. What we do is we certify restaurants, hospitals, cafeterias, schools that serve, procure, market real food. So if you see this in a window, you'll know that if you eat here, it won't kill you. Second, I am the Chief Medical Officer of a for-profit called Slendine, recognizing that processed food is not going away. There's too much money to be made. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure we even want it to go away because we have to feed 9 billion people by the year 2050, and we don't have enough land to do it. So processed food is not going away. The question is, how do you mitigate the metabolic risk? And Slendine is dedicated to trying to achieve that. All right, so you're all familiar with technology. Technology is a tool. And tools, of course, can be used for good, or they can be used for bad. And it depends on whose hands the technology is in as to which one is likely to happen. So, today we're going to talk about digital technology, the wave of things that have happened over the last several decades. We're going to end with Cambridge Analytica. You've all heard of that. And you'll see why that was a misuse of technology in just a moment. So you're all familiar with the upsides of your technology, and in fact, 90% of people like their phones. But there are some downsides, and those downsides are becoming more and more apparent and very real. Number one, we've seen problems with attention, cognition, memory, and learning. Turns out, if you give a kid a test, and you give them the same test on a different day, the only difference being whether their cell phone is in the off position, not standby, but turned off position, whether it's on the table, they do 23% less well, just because of the distraction of it being there. Reading and critical thinking has become a major problem, and we're seeing it in terms of declining test scores. Exposure to unwanted and inappropriate content, those of you who are parents know all about this. Problems with multitasking, which I think is the actual most dangerous word in the English language, because only 2.5% of the population can actually multitask. The rest of us are serially unitasking. And every time you switch tasks, you lose 20 minutes in terms of focusing, and that gives you a cortisol rise, which actually fries neurons. Simulation, self-regulation, we're seeing problems with that in school in terms of impulsive behavior. Depression and emotional well-being, which I will go into in a moment. Lack of empathy. College students who carry cell phones are 40% less empathic than college students who don't. Lack of sleep. 35% of adults today get less than 7 hours of sleep per night, and 23% are clinical insomniacs. And children who charge their cell phone in their room get 28 minutes less sleep per night than children who charge their cell phone outside their room because of the blue light, having nothing to do with its use. Loneliness, and we'll talk about that in great length. Distracted driving and distracted pedestrians as well. You're all familiar now, I'm sure, that Hawaii has actually passed a you can't text and walk at the same time. Cyberbullying, parents' stress, I'll vouch for that, and ultimately hacking the mind. And we are going to talk about that at the end. All of these problems use the same three neural pathways within the emotional part of the brain. Not the cognitive part, the emotional part, the limbic brain. And we're going to outline them now on the next three slides: the reward pathway, the contentment pathway, and the stress-fear-memory pathway. They are all different, but overlapping, and they all have effects on each other and on you. So this is the reward pathway, and you've heard of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And I noticed that for some reason the slides are turned off to the side. I don't know why they're on my computer properly. I can't answer. In any case, the ventral tegmental area is the site of the dopamine cell bodies of the reward pathway. And they send out two projections, one here to this area called the nucleus accumbens, or the reward center. Now, there are two parts to reward. There is the motivation for reward, which is mediated by dopamine, and that's the outward behavior that one visualizes, one views when an animal organism, yourself, goes and does a behavior in order to achieve reward. And then there is opioids, endogenous opioids, which are the consummation of that reward, which is completely internal. So the breaking into a car, that's the dopamine, okay? And the heroin that gets shot up afterwards, that's the opioids. Everybody understand the difference between the two? So dopamine is the motivation, opioids are the consummation, but they often occur in tandem and so fast that you wouldn't see the difference. But what you see is dopamine. In addition, there's an area here called the prefrontal cortex, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment at great length. That is the area of your brain that keeps you from doing stupid things. Okay? The Jiminy Cricket part of your brain. Okay? The executive function center. And reward tends to trump, shall we say, inhibition, cognitive inhibition. We also have an area called the contentment pathway. And it starts here in the dorsal raphe nucleus, which is different from the ventral tegmental area. And the primary neurotransmitter of this pathway is serotonin. You've all heard of that because of SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are used to treat depression. It also innervates the prefrontal cortex, but it innervates the entire brain. And there are 14 different receptors for serotonin, and they do different things in different parts of the brain. The part that is for contentment is via the serotonin 1A receptor. And if you delete that receptor out of mice using knockout technology, these are the most anxious, nervous mice on the planet, and they die early. And finally, the stress-fear-memory pathway. And this is a conglomeration of 4 different areas of the brain. The prefrontal cortex again, the hippocampus, which is the memory part of your brain. That's the part where when you put your hand on a hot stove when you were 3 years old, that's where that memory is stored. The amygdala, which is the part of your brain that goes bonkers when you're walking down a dark alley at 3 o'clock in the morning, whether there's somebody there or not. And finally, the hypothalamus, which controls all the hormonal secretions of the body, including cortisol, which then feeds back on this prefrontal cortex to put it into suspended animation. Thus, when you are stressed, you tend to do stupid things. So, here are the 5 things that have happened to our world over the past 40 to 50 years, partly because we like them, partly because they've happened to us, and partly because they've been marketed to us, and we've allowed it. Technology, processed food, sugar, lack of sleep, and drugs. On the left side, you can see that each of these raise dopamine. And by doing so, it downregulates the dopamine receptor, and we're going to talk about that in a minute as to why that occurs. Add some stress and you end up with addiction. On the other side, each of these contribute to a process in the body known as metabolic syndrome. That is, obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, lipid problems, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, etc. All of which lower serotonin, add stress which reduces the receptor for serotonin, and you end up with depression. So addiction and depression are actually two sides of the same coin, driven by the same 5 processes, all of which have now occupied an outsized portion of our life and our ethos. So we're going to talk specifically about technology today, not the other 4. I could give you hours on those, but today, because technology is so important in the news, because you have an iPhone in your pocket right now, because your children are busy texting right now, you need to know about this. So the questions we're going to answer this morning are, number 1, is there such a thing as technology addiction? 2, is it the same as drug addiction? And if so, why or why not? 3, does technology lead to depression? And 4, are children at more risk? So we're going to start with the last question first. Why children are at more risk? Why this talk is called The Hacking of the American Child? Well, it turns out children are actually at more risk for every neurobehavioral disorder, whether it be impulse control, substance abuse, depression, schizophrenia, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, you name it, and they all tend to congregate around puberty. And there are reasons for that having to do with the brain as well. In fact, if you look at addiction in children, it clearly peaks right here during puberty. And substance abuse in adults can be traced back to adverse childhood experiences, that is, stress plus reward, leading to increased addiction for alcoholism and for illicit drugs during puberty. How about depression? We now have an epidemic of childhood depression. We actually have an epidemic of adult depression. If you look at the data on children, this is children hospital admissions, and again, I apologize for the slide being off here, but this is 0.27% and 0.25% increase per year over these 7 years in the pubertal age group in terms of admission diagnoses for suicide, ideation, or self-harm. And this is outpatient visits, a tripling in the number of outpatient visits with a diagnosis of suicidal ideation or self-harm in those years during which the presence of the iPhone became universal. Now, this is what I'm really upset about because you can't see what's over here. But what we're looking at here is now suicide in children ages 10 to 14. 10 to 14. Okay? This is total deaths here on the y-axis. Here are the years. And what you'll notice is that motor vehicle accidents have gone way down. They've actually been cut in half over this period of time. But suicides have actually now taken over and are actually higher in frequency than are motor vehicle accidents. There are more kids killing themselves than are dying in car accidents today in the 10 to 14-year-old age group. And, as you probably heard with the deaths this week of Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, the CDC released its suicide rate report just like 2 days ago, and it is up 30% in the last 20 years. And you can see it's the entire country, except for Nevada. I don't know what's going on over there. Here's antidepressant use in U.S. adults, basically doubling over this period of time. And what's very interesting, which I find fascinating, is the states that have legalized marijuana, of which we are now one, those states have seen an increase in marijuana use at the same time as simultaneous decrease in SSRI use, and reciprocal. Basically, people are choosing an over-the-counter anti-anxiety agent that they can buy and control over one that is not over-the-counter and that their physician controls and that they have to fight with their insurance company over. That is what is happening. Well, this isn't just an American problem. This is a worldwide problem. Because now 4.4% of the entire world carries a diagnosis of clinical depression. And that is an 18.5% increase in prevalence over a decade. That is quite amazing, and that is not sampling bias. Now, why is this and what is going on? Well, it comes back to this executive function control center of the brain, which is the most vulnerable part of the brain, especially during adolescence, and I will show you why. So, as you can see, the prefrontal cortex, this Jiminy Cricket part of your brain, the executive function, the inhibitory, the cognitive inhibitory part of your brain, occupies 2/3 of the front of your brain. Now, if you go backwards in phylogeny, so here's chimps, dogs, squirrel monkeys, etc., you'll notice it's a lot smaller. The prefrontal cortex is what makes us human. Okay, opposable thumbs and prefrontal cortex. Those are the two things that we developed that differentiate us from the rest of all the species. Okay? Well, therefore, this area clearly developed last in evolutionary terms. And that becomes important when we talk about what happens during childhood. So the functions of the prefrontal cortex you can see here: balancing short-term rewards with long-term goals, so delayed gratification, cognitive inhibition, impulse control, modulation of intense emotions to try to bring them down, shifting and adjusting behaviors when situations change, so malleability or flexibility, foreseeing and weighing possible consequences of behavior, so basically projection, focusing attention, inhibiting inappropriate behavior, considering multiple streams of information and blocking others out. All of those are accomplished by the prefrontal cortex. And as you can imagine, all of those are sorely lacking in our children. And the question is, why is this? And it's on this slide here. So this is a video, and running on a loop, which shows how the brain myelinates. Now, myelin is the fatty sheath that surrounds all the neurons. The reason there's so much fat in the brain, the white matter, right? Everybody knows gray matter, white matter. Okay? Well, the myelin is basically insulating each of these neurons. And you'll notice that the prefrontal cortex over here is the last to myelinate, the last to become blue. And that only occurs completely when you hit age 25, which is why the actuaries alter the insurance rates after age 25. Because before age 25, every teenager thinks they're immortal and they can crash their car into anything. So the data actually support the notion that this process does not complete until age 25. Here's the problem. Let's say you had two copper wires, one bare and one insulated with some plastic around it, and you ran the same amount of high intensity energy current through them. Which one's more likely to short? Anyone? The bare wire, right? The bare wire is much more likely to short with the same current. Well, guess what? Same in neurons. So, can we turn it up? It's not. Well, so much for that. We thought we had this, but clearly not.
We've heard it before.
All right, you know what it was. You all remember that commercial from your right? This is your these are drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? Right? You all remember that?
Yeah.
So the question is, was that true? Was it true? Well, it turns out not quite, because not all drugs fry neurons. Those drugs that are inhibitory, so like benzodiazepines that activate gamma-aminobutyric acid, which are inhibitory, don't fry neurons. Psychedelics do not fry neurons. And as I'm sure you know, Michael Pollan just published a book, that's a full discourse on psychedelics called How to Change Your Mind. But it's not called How to Fry Your Mind. Okay? Because serotonin is inhibitory, and that becomes very important. when we talk about addiction and depression. So things that inhibit the next neuron firing are not going to cause you to lose neurons. Only things that are excitatory. Now, neurons like to be excited. Okay, that's why they have receptors. But they like to be tickled, not bludgeoned. Chronic overstimulation of any neuron will lead to neuronal cell death, and faster if it's not insulated. Everybody got the picture? Okay? So, cocaine, ecstasy, meth, PCP, all excitatory rather than inhibitory. And unmyelinated neurons are more likely to die from chronic excitation. And where is the most vulnerable part of the brain? The adolescent prefrontal cortex. So, drug abuse, bad food, all end up leading to defects in myelinogenesis and development of the prefrontal cortex, leading to alterations in the maturation of the adolescent brain. And these things are permanent. You lose a neuron in the prefrontal cortex, guess what? Don't grow back. And we know that because we can actually show using fMRI studies that there's decreased myelinization in that nucleus accumbens in depression. So dopamine is consistently excitatory. It only excites the next neuron. And long-term chronic firing can kill neurons. And remember, there's a dopamine pathway straight to that prefrontal cortex. So, neurons want to stay alive, so they have a plan B. They have a self-defense mechanism. What they do is they down-regulate the number of receptors on their, postsynaptically, so that there's less chance that any given dopamine molecule will find a receptor to cause that firing. It's a way of trying to protect themselves. Everybody got it? Called receptor downregulation. And all excitatory neurotransmitters downregulate their own receptor. Interestingly, inhibitory neurotransmitters do not downregulate their own receptor, because you don't need to, because you're not going to kill the neuron. Only the excitatory ones do. How about that? So, what does it mean in human terms? Get a hit, get a rush, receptors go down. Next time you need a bigger hit to get the same rush, and the receptors go down, and then a bigger hit, and a bigger hit, and a bigger hit, until finally, huge hit to get nothing. That's called tolerance. And then when the neurons actually start to die, that's called addiction. Everybody got it? Okay. And you can see it in the brain. So this is from PET scanning, from positron emission tomography scanning for the dopamine receptor in the nucleus accumbens, in the reward center. So here's a control brain, and the red means lots of dopamine receptors, and here is an addicted brain, and you can pick your addiction: cocaine, meth, alcohol, heroin, all do the same thing. And guess what? Obesity does it too, because sugar releases dopamine. So you get the same thing. Here's a control brain, here's an obese brain. Same phenomenon, for the same reason. Why? Well, how about because sugar releases dopamine. And anything that releases dopamine in the extreme leads to addiction, including sugar. And the National Geographic knew it and said why we can't resist it. So when someone tells you they have an awful sweet tooth, they're a sugar addict. They're the same. And we actually have data on that, because you can give naltrexone, an opiate antagonist, and increase their nausea based on their degree of sweet toothness. So, technology, processed food, sugar, sleep, lack of sleep, drugs. Now we're going to talk about technology. This is my favorite Dilbert of all time. Memorize it. It will save your life. The MRI shows your brain has been hijacked by dopamine pirates. You are now under the full control of social media, corporations, gambling casinos, and big pharma. Are you writing me a prescription? No, I'm buying stock in those companies. You laugh. This is not a laughing matter. So the question is, do behaviors meet the criteria for addiction? Well, they're not drugs. They're behaviors. So do they meet the criteria for addiction? Well, gambling does, because the American Psychiatric Association, in their DSM-5, and they are the umpire for addiction, classified gambling disorder as a behavioral addiction. So you can be addicted to at least one behavior. Question is, can you be addicted to other behaviors that release dopamine? That's the question for today. So if you look at the functional MRI for internet gaming disorder, which has actually caused at least 20 people in South Korea to die playing video games. I can't say commit suicide because they didn't know they were going to die, but they killed themselves playing video games by not sleeping for 48 hours. Not 48 hours, sorry, 96 hours, 96 hours. You can actually see that the same areas of the brain are involved. The prefrontal cortex basically gets fried. And this is the PET scanning showing the uptake in the nucleus accumbens for the same patients. And you can do it with Facebook, because this is the Facebook addiction score scale over here, and you can see there's the nucleus accumbens lighting up based on use of Facebook. Now, in 2012, gambling was not an addiction. In 2013, gambling was an addiction. Did something change about gambling? No, something changed about the definition of addiction. So the DSM comes out every 20 years. So in 1993, it says 1993 up here, sorry. There were two phenomena that had to be met in order to qualify something as addictive. And those were tolerance, that downregulation of the dopamine receptor we talked about before, and a second one called withdrawal. You're all familiar with the concept that when you abstain from something you're addicted to, you're going to get sick, like the DTs for alcohol, or the jitteriness and the GI abdominal pain from heroin use, etc. Even the irritability from caffeine abstention. You've all experienced that, right? And if you take my Starbucks away from me, I will kill you. Well, turns out those symptoms of withdrawal are not because of CNS effects. They're because of systemic effects on the rest of the body, because each of these are substances. So you can see caffeine changes all sorts of things, alcohol, the seizures and the DTs, nicotine, upregulation of glutamate receptors, and downregulation of GABA receptors, which make you go kind of berserk. Cocaine with hyperthermia, hyperactivity, psychomotor retardation. Heroin, all sorts of stuff, vomiting, diarrhea, mydriasis, myalgia, arthralgia, it's a mess. Okay? All of these are symptoms in the body, not in the brain per se, but in the body that can be quantitated, that there are biomarkers for. So, addiction is tolerance plus withdrawal, at least until 2013. However, the American Psychiatric Association, looking at all the data, said, you know what? Gambling is the same phenomenon. It's just not it's not a substance, it's a behavior. And so they had to requalify the definition of addiction. And they did in 2013. It says 2013 up here. And what they did was they said, okay, it's tolerance, so downregulation of the dopamine receptors, and either withdrawal or this laundry list here called dependence. So now it's not tolerance and withdrawal, it could be tolerance and dependence. And if you read through this is every obese patient, every gambling disorder patient, every everything patient, and guess what? It's every technology addicted patient too. Just read through it. Okay? Everybody got it? So the seeking, the craving, the inability to attend to other events, the distractibility, all of that goes under dependence. So tolerance and dependence is now qualification for addiction. So the American Psychiatric Association has now certified gambling as a DSM diagnosis so that clinical services can be brought to bear. Now, in their infinite wisdom, they have listed internet gaming disorder in the appendix as warranting further study. Now, they have not yet certified technology addiction as a DSM diagnosis. It's true. So if you take it at the, if you want the technical definition, in the United States, technology addiction is not yet certified. True. However, the World Health Organization, in their new ICD-11, I haven't even figured out the ICD-10 yet, they're already up to 11, okay? That's coming out in August, 2 months from now. This is the list: gambling disorder, gaming disorder, other specified disorders due to addictive behaviors, other unspecified disorders due to addictive behaviors. In other words, they recognize the concept of behavioral addiction. So the rest of the world will call it tech addiction, even if we don't. So I have an apocryphal story for you. 1955, World Series. Yankees-Dodgers. Berra's at the plate, Cochran's behind the plate. Everybody with me? Berra takes. Ump doesn't say anything. Cochran, in fury, turns around and says, "Well, was it a ball or a strike?" Ump says, "Ain't nothing until I call it." So, you can take that attitude. Well, it ain't technology addiction because the APA didn't call it. Or you can say, well, you know what? It was a ball or a strike whether the ump knows it or not. So that's your issue for today. The WHO has called it, all right? Different umpire. So which umpire do you want? The one that calls balls and strikes or the one that can't make up his mind? Why does this happen? Well, you're all familiar with habit. So habit is basically the outward phenomenon of a reward pathway. There is a trigger, which is usually stress, not always, but a lot of times, stress, which leads to an action, which could be biting your fingernails or twirling your hair or picking your head or who knows what. And what it does is it alleviates that stress, at least momentarily, sometimes destructively, but at least alleviates the chronic stress momentarily. And that generates a relief or a reward. And so it tends to then repeat itself because it's breaking the cycle, at least temporarily. But you keep doing it because the problem is still there. Everybody with me? That's habit. So what happens in addiction? What happens is there's a slightly different paradigm. And Nir Eyal, who wrote the book Hooked, How to Form Habit-Forming Products, outlines what they do. Instead of just any old reward, they institute a variable reward. So it's not the same every time. Like, for instance, when the emails go off in your pocket, right, when your cell phone rings, you don't know what's on the other end. Could be good, could be bad. And it's that anxiety, that stress of not knowing, which actually heightens it to make it addictive. And ultimately, the only thing the industry is interested in is whether or not you're willing to plunk down another $1,000 for a new iPhone. Because that's how they make their money. And they make their money from eyeball time, right? This business model, because it's all free, right? Okay, and I'll prove it to you, okay, in a minute. So, Sean Parker, co-founder of Facebook, said, "We built Facebook to addict you." Sorry, the word's not there. To exploit you. Sorry, to exploit you. And what he said here, and I'll read it to you since you can't read the whole thing. We need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. He said that. And he knew, because they actually hired neuroscientists to do exactly that. Anybody use the original Facebook in 2004? It was different than the Facebook today. What was different?
No walls.
No, it's not about the wall. There's something else that appeared magically. I'll show it to you in a minute.
Likes. Notification.
The what?
The likes.
Likes, the like button.
Oh.
Yeah, the like button. Okay, so there's actually a company in LA who will weaponize your app to make it addictive by introducing variable reward in some fashion. And it's called Dopamine Labs. You look it up, it's right there. Okay, Dopamine Labs. Dopamine makes your app addictive. That's what this says. So here we are. These 5 things, dopamine, on the other side serotonin. So what happens? What's actually going on? Well, what they've done is they've weaponized persuasion. And the way they did it was this, right? The like button. It's the generator of variable reward. And it's also the generator of enormous anxiety, especially among adolescents who are looking for validation, right? We're going to talk about that in a minute. Basically, it turns a tool into a slot machine. That's what it does. So let's look at the data, okay, on which apps generate happiness and which ones generate misery. Okay, and I'm going to read them to you if you can't read them from there. So the ones that generate happiness: Calm, Google Calendar, Headspace, Insight Timer, the weather, MyFitnessPal, Audible, Waze, Amazon Music, Podcast, Kindle, Evernote, Spotify, the weather again, and Canvas. Notice something about all those apps. What do you notice? They're all unidirectional. They're all apt to you. So you use the information to change whatever, but it doesn't go the other way. Now let's look at the ones on the right side that make you unhappy. Grindr, Candy Crush Saga, Facebook, WeChat, Candy Crush, Reddit, Tweetbot, Weibo, Tinder, Subway Surf, Two Dots, Instagram, Snapchat, 1010, and Clash Royale. What do you notice about those apps?
Bi-directional.
Those are interactive apps. And you're not interacting with the app, you are interacting with who?
Other users.
That are
Addicted.
anonymous,
Oh.
right?
Facebook or not.
Well, yeah, Facebook is too.
Sometimes.
All right, you get the picture, okay? So it is that interactive aspect of it that makes it very unhappy, okay? Tim Cook said, I don't want my nephew on a social network, and to be honest with you, I don't either. And I have proof, because my daughter, who's doing fine, by the way, mind you, okay, in 9th grade, we banned her from all social media, and then she joined the debate team at Lowell High School. And they organized their practices and rehearsals via Facebook, so we had to relinquish that block. And she became a Facebook addict within a year. But she has recognized that she has since rehabbed and is doing fine now. You know, the thing is that there are people out there who know this, you know, and are trying to do something about it. iPhones and children are a toxic pair, say Apple investors. Okay, and this one says, Zuckerberg's dilemma when Facebook's success is bad for society. You know what we're talking about. And what it says here is, the goal, according to Zuckerberg and Facebook, is to boost the well-being of the billions of people who use the social network. I'm going to show you a quote in a minute that shows that that is absolutely, totally false. I'll show you in a moment. Okay? They want to be a positive force in people's lives. I'm going to show you a quote that shows otherwise in a minute. Now, Zuckerberg says, well, yeah, depressed people use Facebook because they're looking for social validation that they can't get any other way. And that is true. I don't argue that. That is true. Depressed people do use Facebook for that purpose. And you can see that if you start out depressed, a time lag analysis of 2 weeks shows that you will be more depressed by using Facebook. But what he doesn't tell you is that even the people who aren't depressed when they start end up more depressed. Okay? It doesn't matter. You all end up more depressed. Everyone gets more depressed using Facebook, not just the people who already started out depressed. So that suggests causation rather than just correlation. Okay? And it says here, you can't read it again, by prioritizing content that sparks conversation with friends, Facebook could risk promoting more polarizing and opinionated posts that generate lots of comments, only adding to the filter bubble, because it becomes a self-repeating cycle. It's a positive feedback echo chamber rather than a marketplace of ideas. So, have smartphones destroyed a generation? Gene Twenge at the University of California, San Diego wrote a book called iGen about this generation. And I will tell you, this generation that's coming up now has 3 things to battle. obesity and processed food, school shootings, and social media. You know, I'm really, really feeling worried about this new generation coming up because they've had it particularly hard. So when your kid gives you a hard time, cut them a little slack. Tristan Harris is a Google ethicist. He was the guy at Google who actually originally built the delay into Gmail. Okay? Who of you here use Gmail? Oh my God. Why? Why use Gmail? It's free.
Works very well.
Good.
I think the dashboard's horrible, but it's free.
Spam is great.
This is not the 1990s, so we use Gmail.
I don't know, whatever. Did you ever notice that it takes about a second and a half for the new emails to populate your screen? You ever notice that? You think Google's just slow? That's built in, that's baked in on purpose to give you that dopamine hit of anxiety and stress, waiting for the emails to show up. Harris knows that because he built it. And he said back in 2010 this is a problem and told the organization back in 2014 that it was a problem. And he has since left the company to start a nonprofit called the Center for Humane Technology to try to undo the damage that social media companies are doing. So again, here's our model. This is the quote I wanted to read to you from the vice president of Facebook, vice president of marketing. And this is, I'll read it to you. We connect people, period. This is why all the work and growth is justified. All the questionable contact importing practices. All the subtle language that helps people stay searchable by friends. That can be bad if they make it negative. Maybe it costs a life exposing someone to bullies. Maybe someone dies in a terrorist attack coordinated on one of our tools. The ugly truth is that we believe in connecting people so deeply that anything that allows us to connect to more people more often is de facto good. It is the only area where the metrics do tell the true story as far as we are concerned. I could stop now. This is what's going on. Eyeball time. It's only about eyeball time. And they have acted that way from the beginning, specifically to increase eyeball time because that increases their profits based on their advertising business model. Well, let's talk about what happened with Cambridge Analytica and how this ultimately became such a disaster. So as you're aware, Cambridge University scientist Alexander Kogan accessed 270,000 Facebook users using a digital app that he provided that actually started in, that he provided, my mistake. He provided that Facebook approved. But what happened from that was they were able to then access 50 million friends from those 270,000 users. And what that app did was it was like a Netflix app. And it basically tried to predict your profile based on your likes and dislikes. So you like this movie, you'll like this next one, right? You're all familiar with Netflix and how they do that. So these are called singular value decomposition and multi-step co-occurrence. And I'm not here to tell you that I understand those. Those are statistical programs that are way deeper than I have the math knowledge for. But they did this online, and it distinguished 95% black from white, 93% men from women, 88% gay from straight, 85% Democrats from Republicans, and 70 to 80% distinguishing 5 personality traits that could be targeted. What then happened was a company in Canada called Aggregate IQ, AIQ, used that information from Kogan to sell to Cambridge Analytica. They then called it the Ripon program, and you can look it up, and they interfered with the Brexit election. Then the Trump campaign found out about that, and decided to use Cambridge Analytica for our election for the same reason, because it worked in Brexit. Now, why did it work? It's on this slide. So it turns out the dopamine response curve in the brain is not straight up and down. It's not linear. It's not diagonal. It's a bell-shaped curve. Now, when you are at the top, at the peak of this bell-shaped curve, you are fun and focused and phenomenal. You are the friggin' life of the party. Okay? There you are, up there. Okay? But if you're to the left of that, you are lethargic. You can't get out of bed. You feel crappy. You wonder what life's all about. If you come to the right of the bell-shaped curve, you are irritable. You are jittery. You are nasty. And we know this because in the early 1970s, we started giving L-Dopa to patients with Parkinson's disease. Okay? Parkinson's disease is a dopamine neuron problem too. Different area of the brain called the substantia nigra controls motor function. Parkinson's disease patients are a disaster. Rigidity, trouble eating, trouble thinking. Okay? But you gave them L-Dopa and they got better. That's what happened in Awakenings. They gave L-Dopa to patients. Oliver Sacks gave L-Dopa to a patient back in the early 70s. But what happened, as in Awakenings, is that 33% of the patients who got L-Dopa became compulsive gamblers or religious zealots. Because they didn't know the dose and they put them over the edge onto the right side of the dopamine curve. Now, since then, we've learned a little bit more about Parkinson's, so that doesn't happen so much anymore. But that's what happened. So what they did, what Cambridge did, was pelt you with non-stop dopamine-generating advertisements that basically took you from here, where you wouldn't vote, to here, where you'd vote for what they wanted you to vote for. So, this is skeptical. This is where you understand that not everything that is marketed to you is true, and you want the science. So I'm going to ask you what this group should know. What is the difference between these two terms, marketing and propaganda? I heard they're equivalent. Is that right? Are they equivalent? No.
Propaganda is to change your mind.
No. Marketing's for changing your mind too.
It's to buy, to sell
A
something.
tiny little bit of truth to sell a lie.
There you go.
To make something sell a lot better.
Bingo. Marketing is using information to espouse your point of view. Propaganda is using disinformation to espouse your point of view. The difference is the truth. And in the US, you can say anything you damn well please, whether you are a person or a corporation. Now, once upon a time, corporate speech was not free speech. They had rules. But that changed in 1980 when the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision called Central Hudson Gas and Electric Corp versus Public Services Commission, basically said corporations have the rights of people to say what they want. And now, of course, corporations are people themselves because of Citizens United. So now, anyone who works for a corporation not only can say whatever they want, but they won't go to jail. Because if a civil suit is brought against them, they're an employee of the corporation. They have the rights of both people and of corporations. So no one's going to jail. Anybody go to jail during the 2008 financial crisis? One guy, an Egyptian who worked for Credit Suisse. One guy. That's it. Okay? Egyptian, not even American. Nobody went to jail. So in summary, technology has an upside as a tool, but downside as interactive entertainment or unfiltered social media. Behavioral addictions are like drug addictions. They don't use tolerance and withdrawal, they use tolerance and dependence. The same dopamine downregulation of its own receptor at the nucleus accumbens and reduced inhibition of the prefrontal cortex to keep you from doing stupid things so that you will do stupid things. But because there are no systemic effects, because their behavior is up here rather than effects down here, there's no withdrawal. Children are most susceptible because they have an underdeveloped and unmyelinated prefrontal cortex. And when those cortex neurons are lost, they don't come back. Facebook and other social media take advantage of variable reward and likes to drive distraction. And finally, propaganda drives dopamine and stress, likely responsible for hacking of people's PFCs and driving altered behavior. Now, the bad part, it's all legal. It's all legal. And so you can be well assured this will happen again unless we do something about it. So, the Center for Humane Technology is trying to do something about it. So you'll notice the board, Tristan Harris, a Google exec, Roger McNamee, an original Facebook co-founder and investor, and people from Mozilla, NVIDIA, and O'Reilly AlphaTech, and a slew of advisors, of which I am one. And we are trying to influence the public through public education. We are trying to influence developers through developing a developer's code of ethics that basically say what humane ethics and technology should be, that everyone should adhere to, and ultimately trying to influence Washington. But as you can imagine, that's a rough go, especially right now. There are 3 congressmen who are interested in the issue. Ed Markey from Massachusetts, Mark Warner from Virginia, both senators, and Joe Delaney, congressman from Baltimore, all Democrats. So, with that, you know what you need to do in November. Thank you.
Okay, so that we don't cut too much into our lunchtime, including the entertainment, we'll have a short question session now because we're already in lunchtime, so we'll go to 12:40.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question is regarding, so Facebook and like other social medias, like they're global companies.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Like Facebook is a global company, and as such, the problems it brings are also global scale.
Of course.
Like it's not just the US, let's all that.
No, it's everywhere.
How do you propose, since basically it's Facebook which can, or like other social media companies which can hire the best engineers, data scientists, statisticians, even neuroscientists, versus there's no, like, it's just like you and I talking, so how do we like basically like fight it?
How do we fight it?
Yeah.
You want to know how we fight it?
Yeah.
All right, well, the first thing you have to do is you have to know what's going on. You can't solve a problem until you identify the problem. Okay? A problem's not solvable if you don't understand the problem. We're trying to get people to understand the problem. It's the reason I'm standing here talking to you, is so that you understand the problem, because you people are scientists. You are skeptics. Scientists are skeptics. Because whatever the dogma was yesterday, you know that dogma is dogma. There's only one dogma. That dogma is there is no dogma. That's the dogma. Okay? Because everything we knew 10 years ago is already wrong. Everything we know today, it will be wrong 10 years from now. And if you believe everything we learned 10 years from now, that's called religion. Okay? And religion can take place within technology. You can have a religious zealotry, as does Andrew Bosworth of Facebook, that connecting people is only good. That's called zealotry. That is not called science. So what we have to do is we have to bring some science, some rationality, some cohesion to the problem. But it is up to you to get your friends to understand this too. And a great way to start would be by telling your friends to get off friggin' Facebook. How about that?
We have one question back here. In your presentation, you put forward the mechanisms of the brain, the impacts, the drivers, the outcomes, and the problem, and present it as if this is totally settled science. Whereas, as we well know, everything, as you've just said, changes, and what we accept today as being a certainty may in 10 years' time be looked at as totally bogus. In the whole presentation, you never talk about any uncertainty. You never say things like, in 70% of cases we found this. It's all presented as, this is how it is, it's 100% definite, and there's no room for uncertainty.
All right, so in the book, you know, I only had 45 minutes, okay? In the book, in this book, there are 600 references to the primary literature, and you are welcome to peruse them, okay? I know what the limitations are. Here's the problem. You have just proposed or posited the pessimistic meta-induction theory. That is, well, since everything we knew 10 years ago is already wrong, why should I believe you now? Because you'll be wrong 10 years from now. And if that were the case, then why would you do research at all? Why would you ever do research if it's only going to be overturned later? Research is not a straight line. It is a zigzag. But ultimately, it moves forward. So I'm not telling you that everything I said today is absolutely the God's honest truth. There was somebody earlier on who said that doctors in medical school do not learn any science. They learn how to treat diseases. That is absolutely not true. They absolutely do learn science. The question is, do doctors afterwards practice what they've learned? That's the question. But in medical school, they do. And they told us the first day of medical school, 50% of what we're going to teach you is wrong. We just don't know which 50%. Does that mean they shouldn't teach us anything because they don't know which 50% it is? Okay? Yes, be skeptical. Please be skeptical. I appreciate your being skeptical. Read the friggin' book.
One more question.
So in the very beginning, you showed the statistics about especially youth depression rising up from 2008 up until now.
Yes.
How much of that could be contributed to actually better understanding depression and better diagnosing it? Because if you ask my parents, my generation didn't have any youth depression. And if you ask my grandparents, they still don't believe depression is a disease, right? How much of it could be actually contributed to actually, you know, believing children and having them properly diagnosed as opposed to actually...
So in fact, there's an entire chapter in the book. There are four chapters. The whole last part of the book is what you can do to protect yourself from this onslaught. Okay? And I call them the 4 C's. Connect, contribute, cope, and cook. And I talk about the role of diet in behavioral health. There are 3 items in the diet that matter. Tryptophan, the precursor to serotonin. It's the rarest amino acid in the diet. You get it from eggs, chicken, fish, not exactly processed food. Omega-3 fatty acids, which you get from marine life, but not any marine life. Marine life that ate out in the wild. Because salmon does not make omega-3s. Salmon eats omega-3s. Salmon eat algae. The algae make the omega-3s. The salmon eat the algae, we eat the salmon. But only wild salmon eat algae. What do farm salmon eat? Corn. Make omega-6s. So if you're going to eat farm salmon, you might as well eat a steak. And finally, sugar, which lowers serotonin through metabolic syndrome. So you want a diet high in tryptophan, high in omega-3s, low in sugar. That's called real food. Unfortunately, what we all developed countries today, all OECD countries and developing countries, have something that is low tryptophan, low omega-3s, high sugar. That's called processed food. So if you buy the food and cook it for yourself, you're going to be a whole lot happier. And there's data that actually shows that and supports that. recognizing that there are two forms of depression. One is called endogenous or clinical depression, melancholic depression, which has been around since time immemorial. And that is where you basically will commit suicide if no one intervenes. But there's another one called atypical depression. And one way to tell the difference between clinical melancholic depression and atypical depression is what's your appetite? Because in the definition of clinical depression, melancholic depression, is you stop eating. Whereas in atypical depression, you actually increase your eating in an attempt to try to get happy, but you don't. So both depressions are out there, and unfortunately, by not recognizing the difference between the two, some of the psychiatric literature has been confused and conflated. We're trying to sort that out for the population because it matters. Because not everybody needs an SSRI. But you know what? Everybody needs real food.
Okay, please thank Dr. Lustig.